The percentage of in the world who are gluten sensitive is 100. 100% of us have some degree of sensitivity to gluten.
Welcome to the Food Matters Podcast, your home for health and wellness. My name is James Colquhoun, filmmaker and founder of foodmatters.com, and I am your host on this journey to inner and outer transformation. Have you got a bad gut feeling about gluten? Well, me too. But honestly, knowing my body and knowing what I know about nutrition and natural health, it's more than just a feeling that something's not quite right. Science is now telling us that gluten intolerance is on the rise and that more and more people around the world are burdened by conditions that are directly linked to gluten. But in a world where gluten is everywhere, and I mean quite literally everywhere, how do you go about avoiding the grain? And what cost will it have on your body if you don't? Well, that's what I'm excited to share with you today. There's no better expert to be talking to this matter than today's guest, Dr. David Perlmutter. He comes with some pretty incredible credentials. Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist, 5 times New York Times bestselling author. He serves on the board of directors and is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition. His books have been published in 32 languages and include the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grain Brain: The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar. Most excitingly, his latest book, Drop Acid, focuses on the pivotal role of uric acid in metabolic diseases and was published in February 2022. For people like me who like to geek out on the science behind nutrition, this book has been monumental. But today, we're here to talk about one of the pressing issues that so many people are facing right now, and that is how to deal with gluten. So without giving too much away, I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Dr. Perlmutter. Hi, how are you today?
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, James.
It's great to have you. So I just wanted to start off with a few personal questions. After going through the book, I've really grasped a lot of the concepts you talk about, and I think it's fantastic that you've, collated this knowledge in such a powerful way. But like I do with a lot of the guests that I've been speaking with this week, is where did it start for you? Were you in the hippie family that were already on the gluten-free message 20 years ago? Or, how did it begin for you?
Well, I don't know that there were hippies 20 years ago. I think that goes back quite a long ways. But I think, I've been asked this question before, and I've had many opportunities to think about what it was that has created me being the odd man out, at least in the world of neuroscience, though I'm not anymore. And I think it really came from a big sense of frustration being a neurologist dealing with really challenging brain disorders like autism and ADHD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, chronic headaches, depression. That's one long breath. But that said, what I realized we were doing in neurology is basically treating the smoke and ignoring the fire. In other words, no one was paying any attention to what is causing these problems in the first place. And I began reading works by a brand new doctor on the scene, a fellow by the name of Hippocrates, who said, let medicine be your food, let food be your medicine. And lo and behold, made some discoveries that, in fact, our most well-respected peer-reviewed literature was replete with research indicating that, in fact, food has a powerful influence on brain health, and no one is talking about it. We talk about a heart smart diet, we talk about eating to prevent forms of cancer, if you will, but no one has really picked up the gauntlet in terms of relating our nutritional choices to brain health. And as it turns out, the brain is very, very sensitive to the various food choices that we make, and is specifically sensitive to elevations of blood sugar, which is a dietary choice. So when you take it to the extreme of, for example, becoming a type 2 diabetic, you've gone ahead and doubled your risk for Alzheimer's, which is a disease for which there is no treatment. It is a disease for which there is no cure. So beyond that, I've been exploring a variety of lifestyle choices and how they relate to brain health, and really have come to understand that we have very powerful leverage points as they relate to actually preventing those dreaded diseases that no one wants to get, no one wants to hear about, these diseases for which we have no treatment.
True, that's great. And I think that's really a fantastic place where your book goes, is talking about how can we really prevent those diseases. But I think in certain parts you make some correlations by the fact that we can really improve the symptomatology of some of these particular diseases by changing our diet and lifestyle as well. Now, I want to jump to a question. I've written down a few pages of my own questions as well, okay. But I want to make sure I try to field a lot of them from Facebook to include everybody in this call. But you just mentioned something there about autism just at the beginning of your talk just then. And there's a gentleman that's written a question here, David Alejandro Call, and he writes, I have a question for Dr. Perlmutter. We have a 4-year-old son that was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. We have been following a combination of the GAPS diet and the paleo diet for the last couple of years. He's taking fish oil, vitamin D3, a specially formulated multivitamin for autistic children that includes folate, 5-MTHF, and lithium. Which other supplements or recommended food changes do you recommend to support his brain function and the healing of the gut and immune system?
Well, at the very end of that question, you really touched on something I think that was really very, very important, and that is the gut and the immune system. Autism is primarily a gut-related disorder, and the brain is secondarily involved. So we know that the array of bacteria found within the gut of the autistic child is different than the normal non-affected child, and that it's almost now a fingerprint that can be used to actually identify the disease. That bacteria influences brain chemistry, it influences brain function, and that is our entrance point in terms of developing a very powerful therapeutic program. We now look primarily at the gut bacteria, at markers of leakiness of the gut, things like LPS, and work very diligently to reestablish gut health. Very frequently, autistic children were either exposed to antibiotics at a young age, they're very frequently born by cesarean section. Risk of autism is dramatically increased in children born by C-section who, because they didn't pass through the birth canal, are therefore deprived of the appropriate levels and variety of bacteria that they would have acquired having passed through the birth canal. This is a huge event in terms of changing the set point of the immune system and inflammation in that individual for the rest of his or her life. The autistic brain is a brain that is inflamed. We know that there is an indication of overgrowth in the gut of particular species of organisms like Clostridia that produce damaging short-chain fatty acids like propionic acid, and at least in the experimental animal can absolutely replicate autistic symptomatology. So it's all about the gut. We are looking at some very aggressive approaches to treating these kids using what are called probiotic enemas, and even exploring now what are called fecal transplantation, which is, certainly by many of your listeners is going to be considered way out there. But I can assure you, having recently attended and spoken at Harvard University just last month, that this is what the future is in terms of not only autism, but in a variety of brain disorders, that it relates to things going on in the gut. I have become the founder of a new medical journal to be released in 140 countries beginning in 2015 called Brain and Gut. Who knew? And I will tell you that, in neurology training, we learned nothing below the neck. That the rest of the body really didn't exist. Everything was the brain. And for me now to be having a discussion with you in the closing months of 2014, talking about the fact that, number one, the gut matters a lot. Number two, the foods we eat matter dramatically in terms of the brain. And number three, we are now looking at protocols for changing gut bacteria to have leverage in terms of treating neurological disease is pretty astounding.
That's huge.
As a matter of fact, a Dr. Barodi, who's down there in Australia with you, was probably the first person in the world to do this fecal transplantation procedure with very successful results in multiple sclerosis, which we know is an inflammatory autoimmune condition that has its origin in what goes on in the intestines.
I think this is a great point of discussion right now because there's so much about, the gut microbiome, and we're starting to understand more about how there are cells in our gut that are identical to brain neuron cells. So there's that connection which is implicitly linked. But one thing you brought up in your discussion just at the start there really perked my interest, and it was about how when children are born, they get access to this bacteria, and depending on the style of birth or the obstetrician, a lot of people aren't really aware of that. I'm seeing more people discuss it now. Can you explain a little bit about that concept and how it works?
Oh, I'd love to, because it's so very, very fascinating. And we inherit 50% of our genes from our mother and 50% from our father. And, we have this notion that this is somehow a blueprint that will then carry us forward through the rest of our lives and influence everything that goes on. And it turns out that the genetic information contained in our gut bacteria may be as much as 1 million genes as opposed to the 23,000 genes that we inherit from mom and dad. So that these bacteria that live within our intestines play a major role in how we respond to the environment, how we detoxify, how we regulate our immune systems. We live in this beautiful symbiotic relationship with these bacteria that outnumber our body cells 10 to 1, and they're influencing any manner of our metabolism, of our detoxification. They produce 95% of several of our neurotransmitters, so they dramatically affect how we perceive the world from moment to moment. And we receive a lion's share of this information, of these bacteria, during the process of being born through the birth canal. Those bacteria that are present in the birth canal at the time of birth are perfectly coordinated with the needs of the neonate, allowing that newborn baby to build a functional immune system, allowing him or her to break down the various proteins and sugars that are found in mother's milk. And when you prevent that from happening by delivering by cesarean section, then that child acquires bacteria that happens to be on the surgeon's gown, that are floating around in the operating room. And these are not the bacteria that child needs to develop normally. So this is the reason why children born by this method, C-section, have dramatically increased risk for various autoimmune and inflammatory issues like autism and type 1 diabetes, and even things like ADHD, twice as prevalent in kids born by C-section. So the empowering part of that story is we're just beginning to see and get our arms around this notion that the types and species of bacteria that live within us are playing a powerful role in determining our health destiny. Now, food matters a whole heck of a lot as we have this discussion, because those bacteria that live within us are very responsive and very malleable or changeable based upon the foods that we choose to consume. When we choose to eat foods that are higher in carbohydrate, higher in sugar, then we change the complexion of the bacteria that live within us, and that alters our immune system. So while a year or two ago we may have had a discussion about the direct role of sugar in insulin signaling and in glycating proteins and leading to free radical production and increased inflammation, we now understand that those same processes affect the gut bacteria and also, perhaps more importantly, affect the leakiness of the gut, so that various proteins, viruses, bacteria, etc., that would normally have been excluded from the systemic circulation, because the gut becomes leaky, then those things get in and challenge the immune system, and that sets the stage for everything bad you don't want to get, including diabetes, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, autoimmune conditions, and even cancer.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, really, and if you haven't read Grain Brain yet, the book goes really deep into a lot of these topics, and I recommend that everybody gets a copy. I have a question here actually from Rebecca Tanner. So she says, I was not able to see Carb Loaded, but I'm currently reading Dr. Perlmutter's book, Grain Brain, and I'm finding it fascinating. For the past 18 months, I've been following a paleo diet. However, just last week, I tested positive to celiac disease. I'm yet to have a biopsy to confirm, but I'm shocked by the result of the blood test. My question for Dr. Perlmutter is, when a person cuts a food out of their diet, in my case gluten and grains, is it possible for the body to consequently create an allergy to that particular food? Or is it more likely that I've been celiac for some years and I just didn't know it? The only time I slip and I eat grains is when I'm occasionally invited over to a friend's house for dinner and I'm served grains. I can't get my head around the idea that I could have celiac disease when I don't eat gluten. Any advice you could give, it would be greatly appreciated.
That's a very good question. I think it was Rebecca, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yeah, and I would say the following. First of all, I don't think, when my patients think they may or may not have celiac disease, should they have the small intestinal biopsy, et cetera, and I generally indicate to them at this stage of the game that they don't need that because they're going to be gluten-free anyway. If you are positive for celiac based upon your biopsy, what is the treatment? The treatment is going gluten-free. Mm-hmm. So that said, why go through the hassle? Now, if you've had blood testing that has shown markers for antibody reaction to certain things like gliadin or tissue transglutaminase, those are certainly suggestive of gluten disease, of celiac disease, but not by any means diagnostic. There's a strong genetic component for celiac. There are specific genetic markers, and possibly they tested you for that as well. But the bottom line is that at the end of the day, you're going to need to be gluten-free anyway. So why go through the hassle of being put to sleep and having a scope put down your throat to biopsy your intestine? That's my opinion. Of course, you have to talk to your doctor about that. But celiac disease is a unique situation quite apart from gluten sensitivity. Globally, celiac disease may affect perhaps 1.8% of the population, and it is a straightforward autoimmune condition, and as such is therefore far more frequent in people born by cesarean section. We're getting back to the microbiome. But having said that, when I wrote Grain Brain, at that time we were laboring over what number should we use in terms of the number of people in the world who are actually gluten sensitive. It's a far bigger number. And I have to say that quite recently I had the opportunity to lecture at Harvard University. And the individual who was lecturing just before me is a fellow by the name of Dr. Alessio Fasano, and he is of Harvard University, a researcher and clinician. And he indicates now that the percentage of in the world who are gluten sensitive is 100. 100% of us have some degree of sensitivity to gluten based upon the mechanism that he has uncovered that has to do with gluten's ability to induce another protein called zonulin and how that leads to leakiness of the gut. That said, in my opinion, we should all be gluten-free. Now, that is a draconian recommendation. And James, you said it yourself, you like big claims. Well, here you go.
That's a huge claim. I'm going to question that claim in a minute, but I love it. So keep going.
But I'm going to stand behind that 100%. We've really got to get our arms around the fact that the health of humans, especially in Western cultures these days, is abominable, and we've got to figure out why that's happening. Now, I'm not going to blame all of our health issues on gluten, that's for sure, but I'm going to blame a lot of it on the massive amounts of sugar and carbohydrates that have found their way into our diets,
Absolutely.
which are having devastating effects. So still, I am a neurologist, and as such, I deal with brain problems every single day. Like Alzheimer's, for which a person's risk in a Western culture is 50-50 if they live to be age 85. That's pretty dramatic. It's epidemic. That's 5.4 million Americans, costing us $200 billion to care for these individuals. We know, according to well-respected journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, that Alzheimer's strongly reflects things like blood sugar, which reflect the type of diet that we choose to adopt. In the journal Alzheimer's Disease in 2012, research from the Mayo Clinic revealed that those individuals favoring a higher fat, lower carb diet had a 44% risk reduction for that very disease that we fear the most, Alzheimer's disease, whereas those favoring a higher carb diet had about an 88% increased risk, again for Alzheimer's, a disease for which, James, as you and I have this conversation, there is no treatment whatsoever. And yet we are told hey, eat whatever you want. Eat, oh, it's your
Just take
birthday,
these
you've got to
drugs.
eat the cake. And then hopefully there'll be a pill. There's no way to treat that disease right now, and it is preventable and relates to food choices.
Fantastic. I love this. This is a very hopeful message for a lot of families out there. I do have some questions here about Alzheimer's. But before I get to that, I just wanted to go back a little bit about your statement there about wanting the whole world to be gluten-free and how great that would be for the world's health. I think a couple of things there jump out for me is that, one, a lot of the gluten-free foods that are being promoted these days are quite unhealthy themselves. I think that's probably another issue we should discuss. But also, I really agree with you in a lot of respects. I know in my particular story, my father was suffering from severe chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, and anxiety. He entrusted his health to the medical profession, was put on 6 different medications, and his health declined dramatically. And it wasn't until we created the Food Matters film and then intervened with some dietary changes that he was able to transform his health. And in particular, one of the things we did was eliminate gluten and a lot of the carbohydrates from his diet, replace that with good fats, lots of greens, and general exercise and a lot of supplementation. We did high dose omega-3 supplementation, we did 5-HTP, we did vitamin C, we did the B vitamins. And
vitamin D.
And vitamin D. He was getting a lot of sunshine at the time. He had a wonderful tan, so that helped. But also, one of the calls we had earlier in the week was Dr. Andrew Saul, and he's an expert featured in the Food Matters film. And one of his idols, and also a doctor that I idolize as well, is Dr. Abram Hoffer. And he talked a lot about gluten sensitivity as well. And he was a medical doctor out of Canada. I think he passed away at the age of 94, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But he had in his career an 80% success rate with schizophrenia by focusing on, first of all, removing foods that people have a sensitivity to in their diet, and then also high doses of supplementation. A lot of the supplements you talk about in your book. We have questions here from people about anxiety and depression, and even going into some schizophrenia and bipolar and so forth. Do you draw, in your book, I see that you draw a lot of correlations between gut health and gluten consumption and those illnesses. For anybody out there that's suffering from those illnesses, what recommendations do you have for them?
First of all, I would say that, the literature that supports a relationship between gluten sensitivity and schizophrenia is mainstream. That's been published in very, very well-respected journals. And what we understand about this very complex protein, gluten, and the various subtypes of it, is that it has some significant effects in terms of binding to certain areas in the brain, mm-hmm. and can lead to changes in how a person perceives the world. But beyond that, gluten does lead to permeability issues in the gut, changing the gut bacteria. And again, brain begins in the gut. Mm-hmm. It's a very humbling statement and a humbling thing for me to get my arms around. But the fact is that these neurotransmitters that are so critical in terms of their balance and their levels, in terms of regulating how we function as individuals, come from the gut bacteria. Sure. Who knew? The gut bacteria are directing us for their own good. They are manipulating how we see the world, so we'll do certain things that are helpful for them. It's like, but at the same token, they're helping us in one way. So it's truly a symbiotic relationship. Abram Hoffer was well ahead of his time, and mm-hmm. many of the things that he popularized for decades are now getting validation in very mainstream publications. Very high-level research are validating those things. So mm-hmm. I think that what we understand when we talk about gluten sensitivity is that some of the downstream effects of gluten sensitivity have effects on the brain themselves. You had mentioned some of the issues that you were putting forth for your father, and some of those, for example, low levels of vitamin D, low levels of B12, trace minerals, other B vitamins, mm-hmm. And lack of absorption of minerals can be as a consequence of the inflammation of the gut brought on by gluten sensitivity. Mm-hmm. Generally, if we see a patient who's got evidence of gluten sensitivity, they'll have low vitamin D levels, their iron level will be low, their B12 levels will be low. And those things have a role to play in how the brain functions moment to moment as well. So as you brought up, it's not good enough to just treat the gut issues and the gut hyperpermeability. You've got to actually put back those things that have become deficient based upon the initial inflammation of the gut. Mm-hmm. Now, One of the markers that we use to assess gut permeability is called LPS, which stands for lipopolysaccharide. This is a chemical that's found on the surface of a large number of bacteria that live in the gut. Normally, we don't measure the lipopolysaccharide in the blood because it's typically not there, and normally we don't see antibodies raised against LPS. When we do, it's a direct indication that the gut lining has been breached and that the immune system has been activated. We see dramatic elevations of this LPS marker of gut leakiness in things like depression and Lou Gehrig's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and even Alzheimer's, and certainly in autism as well. So where I'm going with this is we're now fully understanding that mood disorders like depression are representations of a low-grade inflammation that may very well have its genesis in leakiness of the gut wall.
Okay, well, fantastic. So leaky gut syndrome is a big part of this, so we need to focus on repairing the gut, and that will help with a lot of those illnesses. I wanted to continue with my thread just a little bit before. I'm watching some of the comments come in here now, and I have some extra questions from here, but on more of a nature philosophy type angle here before we get into more of the how-to questions. You know, we've been basically, you know, harvesting and doing some form of agriculture for about 11,000 years here or there. And traditionally, the way that we interacted with grains has been very different than the way that we interact with grains today. And the types of grains that we used to interact with were very different as well. There is strong and rich cultures where we ferment grains, where we treat grains in a different way. Do you see, and there's a lot of people asking here some questions, Marcy Siliba asked, do you include any grains in your diet? I'm sure she's asking you that one. Rachel Giddens, James and Dr. P, can you consume organic brown rice and still stay healthy? And then Callie Lovett, and this one probably ties into my question a little bit here. What's your take on sprouted grains and ancient grains? I've read studies who are gluten intolerant do fine on these types of grains, and 5 people like that comment as well. So do you have any feedback on that, like the sprouted, fermented type grains and some of those ancient grains?
Yeah, I think that sprouted grains and fermented grains are very reasonable, notwithstanding we've got to avoid those that contain gluten. So by definition, grains means seeds of grass. And as such, that would include things like corn and include things like rice. Generally, people also include quinoa in the grain category, although by strict definition it is not. So you mentioned brown rice, and I think there is certainly a place for organic brown rice and ancient grains that are gluten-free. But we have to then take a step back, as you mentioned earlier, about things that are gluten-free still not being good for you. We've got to look at things like rice in terms of the straightforward fact that it does contain a significant amount of carbohydrate. To have half a cup of whole grain rice with a meal, I think, is completely reasonable.
Okay.
I think the problem, at least here in the States with reference to corn, is you'd be hard-pressed to find corn these days that hasn't been genetically modified. And as such, that opens up a whole new area of discussion of concern, not just because, you know, we understand that our food represents information. The very foods that we consume control our genetic expression in a process that we call epigenetics. That said, no one has ever studied the changes in our DNA expression based upon giving humans genetically modified foods. But if we could put that aside for just a moment, recognize that by and large, the reason that foods have become genetically modified is to make them resistant to herbicides like glyphosate, which here in the States is called Roundup. So whether you want to believe that GMO is harming the food and creating a dangerous product or not, what we do know is that GMO foods have lots of Roundup residue in them. And there's some significant research coming out now that indicates that this glyphosate or Roundup herbicide on these GMO crops is a powerful modulator or disruptor of the human microbiome. And in fact, one paper that just recently came out, actually in 3 parts, it was so long, indicated that showed this really clear-cut correlation between increased levels of glyphosate or Roundup on our foods and increased rates of autism. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation, But I think more and more we are seeing that when you
Mm.
change the gut bacteria, there can be devastating health consequences, and we've got to pay attention to that. This is the genie let out of the barrel, and it's very, very concerning to me. So I think the simple answer to your question is yes, there can be some grain consumption,
Uh-huh.
which I think is not necessarily unhealthful, provided that you watch your carbohydrates, provided that you're not consuming GMO type of grains
Yeah.
and that they are gluten free.
No, that's great, fantastic. And I've spoken with a lot of GMO experts as well, and sat in on some panels. And one of the things about how that works is that when the bug eats that particular type of corn, it causes a disruption in their gut and causes their gut to explode, which is how the animal gets killed. So that's having an effect on our gut in a similar way as well, which is causing leaky gut.
Well, and beyond that, how the glyphosate, one of the ways it works, obviously, it's described as being, it inhibits a certain stage in the metabolism of proteins of both plants and bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically how they it's a 7-step process called the Shimataki pathway that makes what are called aromatic amino acids. I don't mean to be too technical, but here's the point. It interrupts the way certain plants and bacteria are able to make protein or make amino acids out of primitive materials. And that said, why should we care? I mean, we're not plants and we're not bacteria. Well, matter of fact, we're 90% bacteria, so it matters a whole heck of a lot to us.
Mm.
We're one part James's cells and 90% bacteria cells is what you are.
Yeah.
So we have to look at that glyphosate or Roundup in a whole new way, recognizing that it has very powerful effects in terms of bacteria, and we need to be fearful of that and really not just practice medicine, but practice commerce under the dictum of above all, do no harm.
Absolutely.
They're saying, well, no one's ever proven that it's harmful. I'd like someone to prove that it's harmless first before we unleash this stuff on the public.
Great. Absolutely agree. 100%. So when you mentioned quinoa there is not a grain, are you referring to it as a seed? Does it sit outside the particular grain category? I mean, grains and seeds, aren't they similar or the same?
Well, it's a seed, but the quinoa plant is not technically a grass.
Okay.
So we call grains are called the seeds of grass, and quinoa is not specifically a grass.
Mm-hmm.
But a very popular grain-like food, certainly having its origins in South America and spread around the world. So, rich in fiber, has some fatty acids in it as well, and some minerals. But again, we need to look at all foods, like even when we're looking at the gluten-free aisle at the grocery store, not just whether or not they contain gluten, but how much carbohydrate do they contain,
Sure.
how much fiber, etc. These are very important issues.
Great. And one of the things that was part of that question as well is that, traditional cultures, the way they've looked after grain is they've always soaked and fermented their grains with that process. And I know, according to William Davis's work with wheat belly, and he discusses quite well how we've hybridized our grains so much that it's higher in gluten, it's got a lower stalk, so it's easier to combine harvest. So we've really altered the grass or the grains that we eat and consume on a daily basis in a big way over those past 10,000 years from when we first started discovering that we could harvest and maintain a grain crop in a small area. So we've changed those grains a lot. But do you think that's one part of the problem? But do you think it's another part of the problem is that we've forgotten how to treat those grains? And also, when you soak or ferment or activate grains, does that reduce the gluten content by any amount?
Well, let me go back a little bit first of all and see if I can really nip this in the bud by indicating that whether it's 10,000 or 11,000 years ago when we began to cultivate crops, when agriculture had its origins, that was yesterday in terms of human history.
Yep.
Meaning that for 99.6% of our time on this planet, we didn't eat any grain. There was no way to eat grain because it wasn't milled and it wasn't grown. And genetically, we are still hunter-gatherers. It takes about 70,000 years for any significant genetic changes to happen in human physiology that would ostensibly allow us to be able to tolerate a sudden infusion of a foreign protein, which is gluten. So that said, There is no a huge modification of the proteins by sprouting, but what we do know, that to get to your fermentation question, is fermentation is a process that happens in nature, and that we then adopted. The hybridization and agriculture techniques to grow grains and other crops isn't something that occurred in nature, but fermenting, basically rotting in some sense of foods, has always happened, and we've been eating foods that have been undergoing that process long before we made it happen. It happens in nature. And the process of fermentation is actually a very positive event, because it allows the growth of wonderful organisms, probiotic organisms, things like Bacteroides species, Lactobacillus plantarum species, for example, that oddly enough have a really important role in healing the gut. So these days, people continue to eat fermented foods like kimchi and yogurt and kombucha that are rich in these very effective, good bacteria that do make it through the stomach into the intestine and have a powerful role to play. Beyond that, if I just may, we are all over the notion that augmenting the growth of those organisms in the body with foods called prebiotics, things like dandelion and jicama and Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, onions, etc. These are wonderful foods that contain certain types of chemicals like inulin that help the bacteria that we have to grow, especially those bacteria that produce products that heal the gut lining, like butyric acid. So I think the idea of fermentation is something we need to really revisit. It's something that is certainly part of many cultures on the planet, and in Western cultures, at least here in the States, it's been really well disregarded.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, things like tomato sauce or ketchup was traditionally a fermented sauce. You know, things like tartare sauce was a fermented sauce. You look at all the rich history of the consumption of fermented sides. You look at the sauerkraut and the bratwurst sausages in Germany. You look at the fermented.
I was there 2 days ago.
Oh, great! I hope you made Oktoberfest. Well, that's a fermented beverage you would have been drinking then as well with the beer. And then in Japan, you also have the fermented and pickled vegetables and the ginger and so forth. If you're looking for a simple way to transform your health, then one of the most important things you can do is to eliminate gluten from your diet. And so many people struggle to get off bread, cookies, and pasta and integrate more whole foods into their diet. And in order to make that simpler and more delicious for you, we have a brand new Food Matters cookbook coming out soon. If you pre-order a copy, you'll get access to a free workshop with myself and Laurentine, where we integrate all the ideas from the films and the teachers we've been learning from for over 15 years and help you land these ideas in your kitchen with morning rituals, breath work, meditations, recipes around smoothies and juices, and daily hacks that we personally use in the kitchen. And I can't wait for you to join us for this free event. Plus, you'll access some book bonuses as well. To find out more, click on the link so you can purchase your copy and sign up for the free event. Now, I have a question here from Susie Bajario. Hope I got that correct, Susie. And she asks, how can we heal and repopulate the gut with the proper bacteria after years of antibiotic therapy? I think this is a big question because, you know, not only are we damaging our gut bacteria through overconsumption of grains and the improper fermentation and preparation of grains, but we're also introduced more antibiotics than ever in the history of the world to the animals that we're eating. We're feeding it to the animals and we're also feeding it to ourselves at a dizzying rate. What's your thoughts on repairing the gut after antibiotic therapy, Dr. Perlmutter?
First, let me say that's an excellent question, because the overusage of antibiotics worldwide is a scary proposition. I mean, this is a direct trauma to our friends who live within us, and we can't traumatize them like that, or there's hell to pay in the form of increased risk for inflammatory diseases. There was one interesting study appearing in the Journal of the American Medical Association that correlated increased rates of breast cancer with antibiotic consumption, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Pretty profound. So the question is really very, very meaningful. And for those who have, in fact, experienced significant antibiotics And as you well mentioned, eating foods, at least here in the States, 70% of the antibiotics manufactured and used in America go into the treatment of cattle because it increases their growth and brings up an interesting point that, one scientist at least, Dr. Blazer, who wrote a book about microbes, called Missing Microbes, talks about the fact that perhaps our obesity issues may relate to the fact that we're eating so many darn antibiotics in the very foods that we eat.
Yeah, wow.
I had the opportunity to hear him lecture a couple of weeks ago, and it's a fascinating contention. But that said, the question, I think, is what do you do and how do you rebuild? And, James, you and I touched upon that earlier with the value of fermented foods, reintroduction of kimchi and other fermented foods, drinking kombucha, kefir, etc., fermented vegetables, fermented sea vegetables, fermented fish, fermented meat. This has been part of our culture for eons. And that said, the appropriate use of oral probiotics, as well as, frankly, we've been administering probiotics through enemas, believe it or not, to get them directly into the colon. As you well know, there is the technique called fecal microbial transfer or fecal transplantation, where individuals who have been traumatized with high dosage of antibiotics, like the last person talked about, actually receive fecal transplants from someone who is healthy. That is the treatment of choice in America now for a disease called Clostridium difficile, a diarrhea illness. And we're seeing around the world people using this technique to reverse certain metabolic conditions. One lecture that I attended a few weeks ago at the Harvard Symposium was a physician in Europe who has reversed diabetes in a large group of individuals by giving them a fecal transplantation. So it's all about rebuilding the gut. So I hope those ideas are helpful for that last individual.
Great, fantastic. Well, I see there's a common thread here in your recommendation, where regardless of the condition, whether it's Alzheimer's or depression or anxiety or ADHD, as one girl is asking here, then it's really about repairing the gut and repairing the gut microbiome. So there's a question here from Joanne Thomas. In what ways do the foods we eat affect the symptoms of ADHD? Which has become one of the most common diagnoses among children as well as adults, and is often a condition where powerful medications are prescribed. Now, I think you've answered a lot about how the foods affect that. So when you look at Joanne's question here, and you look at the skyrocketing rates of ADHD that we see in children's schools, especially in the US, what you're saying is that it's caused by gluten. You're saying it's caused by the overconsumption of sugar, potentially the high fructose corn sugar syrup in a lot of the beverages there. So would the recommendation be the same for children in that way? I mean, how are you going to do a fecal implant or an enema with probiotics, or is it more just focusing on the food and the elimination of grains for children?
Well, it's not, there's not one simple answer here, but let's just take a step back for a moment to your comment about the explosive rates of ADHD in America. And truly, when you think of ADHD, everybody points the finger at America, and rightfully so. In terms of ADHD medications, whereas the United States is 5% of the world's population, we consume 85% of the ADHD drugs that are manufactured in the world.
Wow.
I mean, does that mean that we're just all wired needing this medication? I think not. I think part of the reason that now 6.5 million American children have been saddled with this diagnosis is that people are just too liberal with wanting to make a diagnosis. School teachers are encouraged to point those kids out and get the parents to refer them to a treating physician to make this whole pharmaceutical mechanism happen. We've just extended, according to the American Pediatric Association, the ability to diagnose kids from now age 3 years to age 18 years, meaning you can legally, you can appropriately treat a 3-year-old child with powerful ADHD medications, and that's okay. Because now they've extended that age group. But In terms of factors that lead to a kid not being able to focus in school, daydreaming, not turning in his or her homework, really date back long before any nutrition. It dates back to, as I mentioned, method of birth, whether or not that child was breastfed. Breastfeeding cuts the risk of ADHD about in half.
Wow.
Antibiotic exposure, and of course, early life nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
These are fundamental players. And even if they're not, why not at least give these things a shot? Why not choose to have your child born vaginally and not by C-section? Be judicious in the use of antibiotics. And who knew? Pay attention to the very foods that you're feeding your child. And if your child has been diagnosed, or if you're suspicious that maybe he could or she could be doing better in school and paying more attention, then do your best to eliminate the sugars. Try a gluten-free program, add in some probiotics, check the vitamin D blood level, add in some DHA, really very, very important for brain development. And that said, I think that's the reasonable first step. Above all, do no harm. And when you cross that threshold and agree to give your child a powerful stimulant medication, which is, call it like it is, an amphetamine, which is what the drugs like Ritalin are, methylphenidate, these are drugs for which there are significant side effects like stunting of growth, appetite suppression, sleep disorders, cognitive issues, psychosocial events, tics that these kids develop. So these drugs are anything but a free ride, and yet we are led to believe that, oh my gosh, if Johnny isn't doing well in school, we'd better give him some ADHD medication so he'll catch up. There has never, ever been a study that has shown any academic advantage to giving these drugs in the long term to kids who even have been given the diagnosis of ADHD. None.
Yeah, wow.
So what are we doing? We're poisoning our kids with drugs on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're saying you've got to avoid drugs.
Yeah, that's it's a two-sided approach, but I totally agree with a lot of your recommendations, and I hope that really helped answer the question. Now we have some more questions coming up here and some great stuff, but there's one of the things that I wanted to get to before we get to what Dr. David Perlmutter eats on a daily basis, which I'm sure everybody is dying to know, is there's a question here.
There's no big surprise here. Go ahead.
There's a question here, and I wanted to get to Alzheimer's now, and I wanted to save it towards this end of the conversation before we go into some of the practical things before we wrap up, because it's something that is touching so many people now, whether it's your grandparents or great-grandparents or your parents for that matter. And there's a lady here, Susan Kudhadri, and she says, Q&A for Dr. Perlmutter. Hi, Dr. Perlmutter. I'm so happy you're here. My mother has Alzheimer's and her mother had Alzheimer's. They both grew up on the farm, eating real food from the farm and field. Most exercised every day through to her 84th year. My parents are now in a beautiful assisted living home. She's only on 2 meds and her Alzheimer's medication and depression, which we're all happy about. Many people are over-medicated. I was wondering if there's anything we can do to help her during this awful sundowners episodes which happen daily. It's heartbreaking to watch loved ones like my mother lose memories created over a lifetime and at times not even recognize their own children. I appreciate your contribution to this documentary. Thank you, Susan Country, and she's from Minnesota in the US. So somebody who's at late stage Alzheimer's, is there anything that we can do? I mean, is high dosing on the fish oils or the resveratrol or turmeric, things you mentioned in your book, are they going to work at this stage, or is it too late? What's your thoughts?
Well, let me tell you, Susan, that my father has Alzheimer's. He's 97, and I visit with him before I go to work each morning. He happens to be in an assisted living facility right across from my office. So that's how I start my day. And then I then see patients with this problem and families who are concerned about themselves. So I believe me, I know the perspective if you hear me loud and clear. Dr. Dale Bredesen at UCLA about 3.5 weeks ago published a report indicating actual reversal of Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's in patients treated with a kind of comprehensive program. He developed a 36-point program, but I think the key players were getting these individuals a lot of aerobic exercise, which we know stimulates the growth of new brain cells. And as James just mentioned, turmeric, a new report that I just reviewed has demonstrated that turmeric, aside from reducing inflammation, which is a cornerstone of Alzheimer's, and reducing the formation of what is called amyloid protein in the brain, which is associated with Alzheimer's, turmeric actually now is classified as one of those things that stimulates the growth of new brain cells in the memory center, at least in the laboratory animal. We know that aerobic exercise and calorie restriction and DHA do this in humans.
Wow.
So I never give up. And I would say that I would consider high dosage DHA, doing your very best to engage the individual in aerobic exercise. I think the turmeric idea is very, very good. Mm-hmm. And one thing that you'll find may very well be remarkable is to go out and buy a pair of headphones and play some music for whoever is involved with this problem from the era when that individual grew up. It ties them into some memories. It taps into a certain part of their brain. And wow, we've seen some pretty remarkable things happening. I know this is a nutritional kind of talk we're having at this time, but I will say, hey, give it a try. We've seen some very cool things happening.
Great. That's some fascinating ideas there. I mean, especially the music. What an idea. What a concept. So we have a few more questions coming here, and I want to get to some of the specifics about what you eat on a daily basis. And talking about turmeric, we had a gentleman on the call the other evening, Jason Vale. Now, he's the juice master, as featured in his new documentary, Super Juice Me, and he's also in the Hunger for Change film. Now, I noticed you have a topic in your book where you sort of take aim at a lot of fruits, and I can totally appreciate where you're coming from. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made when I tried transitioning to a healthier diet initially was I overconsumed the sugary tropical fruits. I thought, wow, well, fruits and vegetables, they're all healthy, let's go for it. So I was on papayas and bananas and pineapples to excess, and it really did me no good. And it wasn't until I really got my fat and protein into more balance, and also the greens, that really I noticed a huge improvement in my health. With regards to juicing, I know there's a lot of people on this call and in our community that are really, have been profoundly impacted by juicing, probably in particular fresh green leafy vegetables, and how that's impacted their health. And they've had huge positive improvements in their health, from weight loss to clearing their skin to getting over some serious chronic illness. I know that one of the biggest mistakes people can make is juicing too many fruits. Are you adverse to juicing in that respect, or do you think that juicing, greens and green vegetables is a positive thing?
Let me answer it this way. First of all, a lot of my patients adopt a juicing program and find that their blood sugars are not improved and that they're not losing weight. And I ask them, well, what are you putting in the blender? Yeah. There's nothing miraculous about the fact that when you put, a couple of frozen bananas and some blueberries and who knows what else, some honey in the blender, that somehow it's going to be transformed through alchemy into something that's low in carbs. It doesn't happen that way. So they end up consuming lots of carbohydrate, lots of fructose, lots of glucose, and hence they don't lose weight because of insulin signaling. So, you mentioned colorful vegetables, dark green leafy vegetables. I think that's a wonderful idea. The problem is that there's a lot more going on with those vegetables in terms of the fiber than people realize. So the fiber is really very, very important. And most of the time, people, when they're juicing, are not getting the benefit of that fiber. That goes into the other compartment of the juicer that ends up either getting thrown out or put in the compost heap. But that's a really important, it looks like nothing. It looks like just this massive stuff that has some very, very important attributes in terms of slowing carbohydrate release, sugar release, and also assisting with digestion and acting as a prebiotic. So in that regard, there are various types of juicers out there, some of which actually do preserve the fiber. And I think, those would be my comments.
Okay, great. Fantastic. And there's a lot of people that say that by juicing, you get to, if you have leaky gut or poor digestion, then you can sort of bypass that by letting that liquid go straight into the bloodstream, and that nutrition goes straight in there. But you're saying also that the fiber plays a big part in the digestion process as well.
You don't want to eliminate the fiber because when you do, you're setting the stage for more rapid blood sugar excursions. And as mentioned, that fiber does play an important role as a prebiotic. And I would just as soon for people to eat the kale, spinach, or the chard, and really have that fiber on board. It's really very, very helpful. It's not something just to be disregarded and thrown out.
Great. Well, let's make sure that if people are juicing and the green juices out there, then eat your fiber as well. Make sure to eat those veggies as well. And that's a big challenge for a lot of people, eating lots of vegetables. Unfortunately, it's become a challenge in this day and age. Now, there's a lot of questions coming through. I see them here. Rachel Hind asked, "What about beans and lentils? Any comments on vegan vegetarian diet? And what should we eat?" There's lots of people asking about certain types of foods that we eat. And, I was jotting down a few notes from your book last night about, how you've compartmentalized your dietary approach, so to speak. And I know that you do have the Grain Brain cookbook out there as well, which probably recommends a lot of fantastic recipes that people could use that follow this particular philosophy. But you've broken down, your food groups into sort of 4 categories. You've got fats, protein, low sugar fruits and greens, and then you've got a moderation category here, and then some supplements. Maybe if I could just start with each of those categories, and then you go through some of the top foods that you recommend there, like fats. I mean, what are some of the top sources of fats that you recommend, healthy fats for people to eat?
Well, first of all, the fact that we are even having a discussion where we're encouraging people to eat fat is, it's certainly these days considered iconoclastic that we're telling people eat more fat. I mean, people just recoil at that idea.
Yeah.
If you don't believe it, just say that one word. If you've never met a person, walk up to that person face to face and just say that one word, fat. And they'll be, it's a terrible experience. But the bottom line is our diet has always been high fat, low carb. And we need fat. Our bodies are desperate for fat. It's a wonderful player in the manufacturing of cell membranes, in regulating the immune system, in forming tissues, or rather chemicals like leukotrienes, prostaglandins, all these things, even the neurotransmitters that are manufactured. Vitamin D and the sex hormones and cortisol are made from a particular type of fat called cholesterol, really important for health. So we really have to take a step back and recognize fat is your friend. And adding lots of organic extra virgin olive oil to your program every day, coconut oil, nuts and seeds, fatty fish that are wild but not farm raised. Sources of meat, if you choose to eat meat, should be grass-fed, higher in omega-3, compared to grain-fed beef, which is high in pro-inflammatory omega-6, reasonable. But that said, you mentioned vegan and vegetarianism, which is a wonderful approach to health. I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with the caveats of making sure that you get enough fat, and in the case of being vegetarian, that you have good sources of vitamin D, B12, and trace minerals, because many times, because we do nutritional analysis on virtually all of our patients, doing blood work, determining where people are in terms of their needs. And by and large, what we see in the vegetarian group is that they are, in fact, low in things like B12 and oftentimes iron and vitamin D, etc. So you need to have good fats in your diet. And by all means, these can be of vegetarian sources, like I mentioned.
So you heard it from the horse's mouth, Dr. David Perlmutter himself, fats and proteins. He was talking about olive oil, avocado, coconuts, nuts and sunflower seeds. You also talk about butter in your book. I've since, really, I was anti-butter and anti-dairy in a lot of ways early on, but now I've really come around and I'm enjoying lots of grass-fed, really well-prepared butter, and organic, of course, because with the fat-soluble foods or the high-fat foods such as animal products and nuts and seeds, we really need to make sure we're getting them organic, because a lot of toxins are lipophilic. They attach to the fats. So you say butter here as well. Is that something that you recommend in your dietary approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say go hog wild and eat a lot of butter, but you can have butter if you like butter. Over the years it was, well, have bread and butter. Well, maybe you should just have the bread and not have the butter. No, it's in fact just the opposite. You should have the butter and not the bread. But what you say is in fact very important, that butter should be from grass-fed, organically raised cows. because butter is a product of bioconcentration. And if
Mm,
that cow is grazing on a pesticide-laden food, then you're going to bioaccumulate that in the butter, in the fat, and then you're going to consume that. I tend to favor more of the vegetarian types of fats,
okay,
like coconut oil and olive oil. I think
great.
they're very, very healthful. And it brings up the point of coconut oil. Here's an oil, a fat that is more than 90% saturated fat, and
Mm.
that gives people the willies. They say, "Oh my gosh, you're telling me to eat saturated fat?" And some of the comments that I get in social media are, that's going to cause my cholesterol to go up. Well, no, it's a vegetarian oil. It doesn't contain cholesterol, which is something found only in animal fats, number one. And number two, it's good that it's saturated. By virtue of the fact that it is saturated by its chemical definition,
Hmm.
it cannot be oxidized like an unsaturated fatty acid
Sure.
molecule. So, 50% of the fat in human breast milk is saturated fat. And that said, in the spring of this year, a study came out from the Annals of Internal Medicine of more than 500,000 people and found that there was no correlation with respect to consuming high levels of saturated fat and the risk for heart disease. So it's time that we get these bogus ideas about fat and saturated fat out of our minds and realize that we need fat, and that if you want to lose weight, if you want to be thin, eat more fat and at the same time cut your carbs. It seems paradoxical.
What a concept. And especially because we're just sort of emerging from the era where we said, eat carbs and don't eat fat, and restrict your cholesterol consumption and move towards vegetable oils and margarine. I mean, it's fascinating how we even got there. And for people that have watched the Carb Loaded documentary, I'm sure you've seen a little bit of the history behind that, and Ansel Keys's history about eliminating a lot of countries in his
Oh
study.
yeah.
So, I mean, this is we're at the forefront of nutrition here, and we're speaking with yourself, and it's just great to hear this information coming from you.
Well, you mentioned earlier the food pyramid, and on the bottom of that food pyramid that was created by the agricultural groups here in America are the whole grains and the breads and the pastas, etc. That's what we were told should be the basis of our diet. And the very top of the food pyramid was
The
this
fats.
tiny little bottle of olive oil sitting there all by its lonesome because no one should pay any attention to it. Well, olive oil is one of the fundamental players in the Mediterranean diet, which
Mm.
has been proven to be effective in
Hmm.
reducing progression of Alzheimer's disease and certainly risk for coronary artery disease and diabetes and cancer for that matter. So, again, the science out there that's supportive of the notion of welcoming fat back to the table is vast. And that's why, leading into probably your last question, I have a bottle of EVU, extra virgin olive
Hmm.
oil, organic, that is something I use with every meal. It's
Hmm.
with my 3 egg spinach omelet in the morning,
Hmm.
lots of extra virgin olive oil with a little bit of organic goat's cheese on top of that as well. At lunch today, we had uh, kale with halibut and covered that with, who knew, extra virgin olive oil. At breakfast, I have a cup of coffee.
Hmm.
Tonight, we had a little bit of free range chicken, but mostly a mixture of kale and spinach, and then a really beautiful salad that my mother-in-law made, which and brought over to us because we had been traveling. It was really very sweet of her. So, people think that this is challenging and hard, and it really isn't.
Mm.
It's not. You don't have to make these, extensive meal plans. You just have to learn what to eat, and more importantly, what to avoid. And once you
Hmm.
learn that, once you learn to get the willies around foods that are high in carbohydrates, and know what contains gluten versus what does not contain gluten, and there are plenty of foods that have hidden gluten in them, life gets very, very easy. The challenging issues become traveling, in which case you have to be creative. I oftentimes bring food with me. I'll pack avocados
Hmm.
and cans of salmon and lots of walnuts and pecans to carry in the suitcase. until I get to a place where I know there will be good food.
Yeah, I had an omelet this morning, and I used the whole of the egg, which is controversial to some people. I mean, I've spent, a few years living in Southern California as well, and I was a couple of blocks from Gold's Gym where Arnold Schwarzenegger would work out, and there's cafes all around there that cater to all the bodybuilders that do the egg whites only. So I want to hear about the center of the egg and how important that is in your perspective. But talking about protein sources here, you talk about in the book, you talk about eggs, wild fish in particular, which is very important, shrimp, crab, lobsters, clams, grass-fed meat, and chicken. And you also did say as well that, having a vegetarian and vegan-based diet, it can be very healthful as well. How do you feel about beans and legumes for vegans and vegetarians? I know there's a question here in the Facebook comments just previously from a lady. And, we see a lot of cultures around the world that eat that primarily as a food source, like some of the Indian cultures eating a lot of lentils and so forth, and beans. How do you feel about them in the diet?
My sense is that they don't create as big of a problem as foods that contain gluten.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize fully that vegetarians have to have some vegetarian source of protein and therefore need legumes. The downside seems to be that oftentimes people who are eating a lot of legumes do become somewhat mineral deficient. Is that necessarily a consequence of the phytic acid that
Sure.
legumes contain, which tend
Sure.
to bind minerals? Is it because legumes contain things called plant lectins,
Mm-hmm.
as does wheat,
Mm-hmm.
which are actually very inflammatory and do disrupt cell membranes? Unclear. I think that Dr. Lauren Cordain has done a great job in explaining why legumes can potentially be harmful. But, what I often recommend to my patients who are at least not wanting to eat meat would be some form of vegetarian protein, like rice protein, which they can use as a powder that's added to their smoothie in the morning. If they're willing to eat eggs, that's great. If there's a moral issue here of harming an animal, then the eggs are a really good idea. And I want to just amplify the notion of this ridiculous egg white omelet as if somehow that was good for you. And it turns out that in terms of cardiovascular risk, whole egg consumption is more associated with decreased cardiovascular risk than in individuals consuming the egg white or the egg substitute. Mm-hmm. So the egg yolk, there's been a brand new discovery about the yolk of an egg. It contains a chemical that has incredible health benefits that actually serves as a precursor to some very important brain chemistry, etc. And it's called cholesterol, a wonderful newly discovered chemical that's really critically important for brain health, immune health, and even heart health. So I know probably no one's ever heard of it yet, but pretty soon they'll hear of this new chemical called cholesterol and realize how important it is for health.
So we shouldn't. We shouldn't be taking statins then.
Well, I mentioned it because in the elderly population, there is an inverse relationship between risk for dementia and risk and levels of cholesterol. Higher levels of cholesterol are brain protective. Higher levels of cholesterol are associated with reduced risk of death year to year. So, and yet people are driving their cholesterol levels down into a ditch by taking these statin medications so that, and it's compromising brain function. We now have in America warning labels on the statin drugs indicating they can compromise memory. There's an entity people are talking about now called statin brain, which we see on a regular basis.
Wow. So eat the egg yolks because they have the powerful DHA and EPA. And I also heard that, by making sure not to overcook them as well, it can protect those fats in the egg yolk, which are very easily damaged by heat. Is that correct?
That is correct. With the caveat that there has been some salmonella transfer from undercooked eggs. So people have to kind of weigh that. I mean, I think soft boiling or poaching is a good way without, going overboard. But you're right, there can be some breakdown of some of the fatty acids in the egg yolk, and to a lesser extent the protein in the white, by overzealous cooking. So
Sure.
Good point.
Okay, and let's go to, so we've covered some fats there, we've covered proteins for vegans and vegetarians, plus also those who choose to eat some animal products. Now to fruits. What types of fruits do you recommend?
Overall, I think people should be a bit restrictive with respect to fruit. I mean, again, that really sounds like anathema. Here is a doctor on your program, on this interview, saying you should restrict your fruit. Have your apple a day, have a handful of blueberries, have a banana if need be. But it's not 6 servings of fructose and glucose containing food. People love fruit. And you know why you love fruit? Because it's got sugar in it. Face it. It's not that there's any other reason. I mean, it's not a dramatic taste explosion. It's because it is sweet. And then again, the notion of fruit juice, I mean, we're all told, my gosh, breakfast, you need to have a couple of 12-ounce glasses of orange juice to get your day started because of all the wonderful vitamin C. There's 36 grams of carbohydrate in a 12-ounce glass of sugar. That's 9 teaspoons of white sugar. Wow. So have a couple of glasses. That's 72 grams of carbs before the waffle has even arrived with the maple syrup. So call it like it is. It's pure sugar. Now, it doesn't mean you can't eat a whole fruit containing fiber that helps slow the sugar release. But the notion of this 6 to 8 servings of fruit a day does nothing more than make the fruit growers happy. And I would mention, in terms of types of fruit, that really one of the biggest things to be concerned about are the dried fruits, because not only is that a concentrated source of sugar, but what is called the glycemic index of things like prunes and figs, apricots, is very, very high, meaning that it's going to not only raise blood sugar, but keep blood sugar elevated for a longer period of time, and therefore cause the changes that blood sugar can wreak upon the body, including binding to protein. This process called glycation, where sugar binds to protein, increases inflammation and increases the production of chemicals called free radicals, which damage our protein, our fat, and even our DNA.
Wow, wow. So here, looking at the fruits that you do recommend, I've got a little bit of a list here that I have taken from your book. You say cucumbers, which is a fruit, tomatoes, also a fruit, or tomatoes, as we say down here.
Which are also
also a fruit. Squash, pumpkin, eggplant, and lemons and limes as well, which I love lemons and limes. And also included in that list is probably one of the fats you recommended earlier, which was avocados. So there's some great fruits there. Now to greens, I'm looking at some of the greens list here. You've listed here some of the things you were saying that you've eaten today, like spinach, for instance. You also talk about cabbage, onions, mushrooms, garlic, and asparagus, things like that.
What beautiful foods these are.
I know. I mean, how could we go hungry with all this food?
Gonna go hungry here.
And then in moderation, you've mentioned some of the things earlier, like some of the grains. And I know a lot of the questions we had earlier in this call were about, well, what grains are okay, or what's okay. And you've mentioned here some of the things like the lentils and the beans and the quinoa and the rice, berries, also cottage cheese, milk and cream in moderation, yogurt and carrots, things like that. So some really, I mean, if you look at that list there and you eat from that list, you're not going to be hungry. I mean, there's so many wonderful foods.
You're not going to be hungry. You're getting great nutrition. You're eating foods that are nutrient dense. You know, that's what's going on in Western cultures. People are overfed and undernourished because they're eating lots of food containing lots of calories, but with really no nutrient density. So they're starving in the face of plenty. And it just doesn't have to be that way. I mean, and what I'm proposing here is not necessarily hugely expensive. And when I'm challenged by that notion, you know, I talk to people about what is the cost of becoming a diabetic, developing cognitive decline, developing cancer, etc. Those are the expensive issues in our lives that we can avoid simply by choosing to eat right.
I totally agree, 100%. I'm sure that there's a lot of people raising their hands with excitement on this call around the world, and we need to make sure he gets to bed. He's got 2 more things. Dr. Perlmutter is actually going to get that guitar out and play us a song that's just over his shoulder.
I might very well do that. The problem is if I slide back to get my guitar, then your viewers are going to know that I, like you, am wearing shorts right now.
That's true. We're both wearing shorts. So he's not going to play guitar, but there is one question that I do want him to finish on. And what about supplements? You know, you've mentioned specific supplements for people throughout the call with regards to some particular illnesses. You know, are there supplements that people should be taking on a day-to-day basis to promote general health? And I guess they probably also correlate to some of the supplementation you recommend for people with chronic illness?
Well, the answer is in an ideal world, I think maybe there wouldn't be a need for supplements. We don't live in an ideal world. I recommend supplements. I take them myself every day. And I think a good probiotic is really important. Some form of DHA, which most people get from fish oil, but you can get from algae, so therefore a vegetarian source.
Okay.
There are a couple of other players that I think are really important. We talked about turmeric earlier, and my gosh, the information coming out about turmeric every single day is really breathtaking. I, at risk for Alzheimer's disease, having a parent with that illness, take turmeric because of the research indicating its role in helping the brain. I think added good fat in the form of coconut oil, which should be organic, is really a very important thing to do. And I think certainly something that's very underrated but nonetheless pivotal in terms of brain health is vitamin D.
Yeah.
Now, we've all heard that vitamin D is really important for healthy, strong bones, on and on. It turns out that vitamin D in human physiology activates more than 930 genes, most of which live in the brain. So we have vitamin D receptors throughout the brain. And, again, people by and large are low in vitamin D. And that is because we tend to wear clothes when we're out of doors in public places. Now, I'm not advocating...
Except you and I, we're wearing shorts, so we get some sun on our legs.
Okay, lots of vitamin D on my legs right now, that's for sure. But that said, I think that, the question would be, well, then how much should I take of D3? And I would say, I don't know. Generally, we start at about 5,000 international units a day for an adult. But the key here is to follow the blood test. And, here in America, we have a scale of between 30 and 100 micrograms per deciliter as being our normal range. And it varies in different countries. They have different scales. But that said, people say, well, 30 to 100, my level is 32, I'm fine. No, you're not. You're just scraping by with a minimally passing grade. Let's shoot for what's optimal. Let's get at least to the middle of the scale, if not the high end of the scale. We are just beginning to learn how very important vitamin D is in human health. And I had the opportunity in September to chair an international brain conference. And one of the individuals I invited was a surgeon, actually, from Georgia here in the States, who has demonstrated some profound effects of vitamin D in terms of survival after trauma, after head trauma, comparing people with high levels of vitamin D in terms of how quickly they get out of the intensive care unit after major surgery. So it's a very key player. So I think that's the list. Certainly other people, like we mentioned, vegetarians and their need for trace minerals and vitamin B12, for example. So there, really needs to be some individual considerations as well.
Great, fantastic. So I'm just going to recap some of that for everybody here. So there was the DHA or the omega-3 supplementation, which can be from fish oil, also from krill, and also from, you said algae sources, turmeric, probiotics, coconut oil, and vitamin D, starting at 5,000 international units. And you said something really interesting there, that there's a big difference between the RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance, or the dietary allowance, which is set really as a minimum, and then what is more optimal. And we should be really shooting for the middle to optimal range of a lot
of
those. No
question. This minimum daily requirement, and you see these multivitamins that you buy in the grocery store that say 100% of the MDR, and that means that at any level below that, you're going to get a deficiency syndrome. Like if you don't have the MDR of vitamin C, you're going to get scurvy. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in optimizing, these levels. And frankly, we have here in the States, and you probably do in Australia, wonderful blood tests, comprehensive panels that allow you to assess each individual in terms of what his or her needs are. And certainly we know that needs for certain vitamins and other nutrients go up depending on, for example, what a person's pharmaceuticals may be. Certain drugs inhibit our ability to absorb things or metabolize things, so we have to keep that in mind. And that said, other individuals have various genetic predispositions wherein they may need higher levels of, for example, a folate or other B vitamins like B12.
Sure. Fantastic. I have even more questions coming through right now, but I want to make sure that you don't have to stay up too late. You've got the in-laws there by the sounds of it. And I just wanted to thank you so much for your time and also to participate in a fantastic documentary, Carb Loaded. Congratulations on your part in that film. And, I'm so impressed as to how the film's come about and how it's been, able to be seen by so many people now. And let's hope it can continue to be shared and seen by more people all over the world. So thank you so much,
James,
for
you're
your
doing
time.
a great job, and we all appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We'll have a good night's rest. Get your 7 hours plus that you talk about in the book.
Okay.
And strum a tune for us before you go to bed so we can imagine what that's like.
I will do. Thanks again, my friend.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good night.
Okay, bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family on social media or leave a comment below. We love hearing from you. If you want to find out more and sign up to our podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode, head to foodmatters.com/podcast. And I look forward to seeing you next time.